Hello everyone and welcome to this video on political systems. We have a lot to get through in this video. The topic is a really broad one. Politics and political systems is one of the most contested areas in human life. So pretty much every political system is fiercely contested. Politics is constantly argued, debated, fought over, in many cases physically fought over as well. So what we are going to try and do is really capture some of the basic fundamentals that we need to understand about political systems in order to really develop our understanding of how the international arena functions. So we are going to cover quite a few things. This may be one of the videos where you benefit from pausing, rewinding and rewatching sections as well. So we're going to try and have some responses to three fundamental questions. The first is really foundational: what are political systems? Then we're going to move on to different ways we can classify political systems to understand the differences between them. And then lastly, we're going to think about what kind of political system does international business prefer, if there is a practical as well as theoretical preference. So we're going to start with the first question. What are political systems? When we talk about political systems and democracy, authoritarianism, dictatorships, what do we actually mean? And what are some of the most important underlying features that really determine or suggest which political systems are in place? So if we start with a definition of politics, political systems are by definition centered around ways of organizing politics. We have our classic definition of politics in that it is who gets what, why, when, and how. And this is very much at the heart of politics as a human activity. Politics is really the art of governing, and the purpose of governance, at least from a social standpoint, is the distribution of resources and the imposition of norms, and this really does capture that quite well. So which groups of people or individuals get access to what resources, for what reason, when and how will that access actually take place. So if you consider political issues that have been prominent in the media over the last year or so, this is pretty much fits into this definition. The argument over school meals in England, again, a distribution of resources. Bank bailouts, from the financial crash, very much distribution of resources. Discussions about furlough support for individuals affected by coronavirus. All of these things are very much a distribution of resources issue, as well as some of the high profile debates that we've seen with the European Union, including things like fishing rights and so on, migration rights, travel rights, free movement. All of these are very much a distribution of resources issue at their core. So if that's our working definition of what politics is, then this leads us on to understanding how we can define political systems. So the institutions and mechanisms by which a territory is governed. So the classic definition of a state is sovereignty, territory, and people. So people plus territory, with the single system governing it, would be a single political system. So by institutions and mechanisms, we're talking about things like governments, like monopolization of violence through police forces and armies, tax regimes. All of these things will be institutions and mechanisms for governance of a particular territory or a particular people. So if we develop that further, we come to understand that political systems very much define the norms by which political activities are governed, and also, most importantly, provide a framework in which resources are distributed to various groups, be those population groups, demographic groups, particular ethnic groups, class groups, or indeed individuals as well. So this is our working definition of politics, leading into our working definition of political systems and how they operate or what influence they exert. We do, however, have to recognize that political systems are not the same as political regimes or even governments. So if you look at the UK, it's a single political system, it's a single sovereign state. Whether you have a conservative government or a Labour government, or indeed any other form, any other regime in charge or responsible at the top of the political system, that doesn't fundamentally change the political system itself. The UK, it's still a constitutional monarchy. It's still a representative democracy. You still have the same basic governance structure in place. So individuals may come and go. The constitution of the government may come and go. Different elements may evolve and change over time. But this doesn't mean that we've replaced our political system. So we can think of political system as, broadly speaking, as a vehicle or a car, maybe a good metaphor or a good analogy. So you may change drivers, you may change passengers, but the car remains. So we may have different individuals operating within the political system. We have different governments, different parties in the legislative body, but the political system itself persists. It doesn't change with the change of government. So the driver may change, but the car itself remains the same. So that's our definition of political systems and a brief discussion on how we can understand political systems themselves. So we're going to move on now to our second question, which is about the classification of political systems. How can we distinguish political systems from each other? How can we group them together? So how can we identify political systems which are similar to each other? What features or elements of political systems are most important when it comes to grouping or classifying them, and to develop our understanding of comparing and contrasting political systems. So that's going to be our focus for this middle section of this video. Well, we're going to start not by actually looking at any of the governance features, but rather some of the underlying philosophies underpinning political systems. Like we said, the core working definition of politics that we're going to use is the definition of who gets what, why, when, and how. And we have two major approaches to this question. And this is contrasting. Societies tend to be, to some degree, either collectivist or individualist. Now, this is a spectrum. It's not a category question. You can't say that this society is definitely collectivist and that society is definitely individualist. Think of it like a spectrum. So there will be countries along the spectrum at various points, some slightly more collectivist, some very much collectivist, some slightly individualist, and so on. So it is a broad spectrum, but it does help us understand and compare and contrast some of the underlying foundations of different political systems. So we're defining collectivist or collectivism in this case to be placing the rights and the role of the community at the heart of both society and governance, or at the heart of the political system. Whereas an individualist society places the rights and role of the individual at the heart of both society and governance, and therefore the political system. So we can say societies such as the United States of America and the UK are usually held up as very strong examples of an individualist society, where our primary focus within society focuses on the individual. It focuses very much on the rights of the individual as well as the role of the individual when it comes to governance, participation in the economy, participation in the workforce, as well as participation in representative democracy. So the US and the UK are good examples of an individualist society which prioritizes the rights and role of the individual, whereas we can look at societies such as Saudi Arabia perhaps, or Thailand, or other countries, similar countries, as being examples of collectivist societies where the rights and role of the community are usually prioritized over the rights and role of the individual. So this means if we want to understand participation in the workforce or participation in the economy, we don't just need to look at the individual as a unit of study, but we should be looking at the both the entire community, but also individual communities, groups and subgroups within that society to understand how that actually functions. So the perception and the approach and understanding of how society operates is significantly different from individualist societies. Now, it's important to recognize, as we said before, this is a broad spectrum, and it does change depending as culture and human societies change and evolve. There will always be a change, evolution and swing between the two, as well as perceptions do differ. So if you were to ask two people from, let's say, Vietnam about whether Vietnam is a collectivist or an individualist society, depending on their own personal experience, you may come to two very different answers. Some say growing up in the urban areas in Vietnam, where there is foreign investment, there's presence of foreign companies, there's a stress on the individual, may perceive Vietnam to be a more of an individualist country than a collectivist country. Someone coming from the rural areas of Vietnam with strong collectivist traditions and a strong traditional culture may perceive Vietnam to be more of a collectivist country. So there is absolutely going to be debates and contestation, but it's a useful distinction in our minds when it comes to understanding some of the underpinnings of political systems. We do have to understand that political systems do not arise from in a vacuum. They don't arrive out of nowhere. They arise out of the broader society, and they are in a symbiotic relationship with society. So if you take the same formal governance structures, the same type of parliament, the same body of laws, the same civil service processes, and you plant them in two very, very different societies, you're going to get two different political systems, regardless of how similar they appear to be on paper. So if we move on to look at another distinction, which is actually looking at how governance works within a given territory, the major distinction that we can see would be between democracies and authoritarianism. Just like our previous distinction between collectivism and individualism, the distinction between democracies and authoritarianism is a spectrum rather than a category difference. And to be honest, if we look at what's happening in the United States over the last 4 years of the Donald Trump presidency, we can see very clearly that democracies exist in a state of perpetual motion, that you don't just flip a switch and you're a democracy, but rather it's a spectrum of democratic elements and non-democratic elements. The same thing very much applies to authoritarian systems as well. There's going to be a mix of elements, and there is going to be a spectrum along which we can place various countries rather than just labeling them just a democracy or just an authoritarian country. It is a broad, complex spectrum. But nonetheless, it is a useful distinction for us to have in mind. So we are going to explore both of these in a bit more detail. So if we look at democracies first, well, democracy is really difficult to define. It's highly contested, and you'll find lots of different passionately argued and sincerely held beliefs about what actually constitutes a democracy. But if you look at the word, it's derived from ancient Greek, and we have the famous example of Athens as an early example of democracy, where it means rule of the people. So krisi meaning rule, and demos meaning people, so rule of the people. However, that seems like a nice simple definition. It's a definition where it's a political system in which people will rule themselves. In reality, it's quite a tricky notion, and Athens is a really good example of this. So while Athens is often regarded as the birthplace of democracy, it is not a democracy that we would recognize today. So free adult males participated in governance. So if you were a free adult male, you very much would perceive this to be self-rule, or where the people ruled themselves. If, however, you were a woman, this is not the case. You did not participate in Athenian democracy. And if you were a slave, of which the Greeks, very much like many in the ancient world, enthusiastically practiced, if you were a slave, again, you not only were not given the same rights and obligations as free folk, you also were not permitted to participate in governance in any way. So we have a minority of people in ancient Athens who could justifiably say that they were ruling themselves, but this was not the case for the majority of the population. This is a useful thing to bear in mind when we examine democracy in today's era. Which groups of people within society hold which degrees of power. And again, we can draw parallels here with the attempt to disenfranchise people in the US in the most recent presidential election, where entire groups of people in locations such as Detroit and Michigan, there was an attempt to remove their votes or not count their votes. Again, this is not a new thing. This is really one of the central tensions of democracy. Whose votes counts, or who rule themselves, and who is valued in society versus other people. It's a tricky issue which is moving back and forth. And we can see this in other countries as well. So the UK has a reputation for being one of the world's oldest democracies. Parliament is called the mother of parliaments. And it's generally seen to have a long democratic tradition. Women have only relatively recently actually achieved the vote in the UK. The UK was not the first country to grant women a political franchise, i.e. allow them to participate in political governance. And that was relatively recently, only about 100 years ago. Entire groups of people in the UK were effectively disenfranchised again until relatively recently. The UK's got a long colonial history, and therefore there are significant racial tensions throughout recent UK history as well as the UK present, and participation in governance again has faced practical barriers. Even when there was theoretical franchises extended to various communities. So that is one tension when it comes to democracy. We can't just see it as a simple definition, well, any system where people rule themselves is a democracy, because there are lots of gradients of distinction and meaning within that definition. Another thing to bear in mind is that the manner of governance in a democracy varies hugely. So you have parliamentary systems and you have congressional systems, but also these are all what we regard as representative democracies. So people don't actively participate in governance, but rather they select through lots of different methods representatives who actually then pass laws and engage in governance, as well as form governments, executives, prime ministers and presidents and so on, and participate in foreign relations and so on. So representative democracy is one form of democracy. There's quite a few others as well: direct democracy, participatory democracy, fluid democracy. So it is a vast and complex area. So again, we can see that there's lots of gradients of meaning and lots of contestation and debates about the form democracy actually takes. Lastly, we do need to understand that the selection of a parliament or a congress doesn't necessarily define a democracy wholly. Instead, what we commonly call Western liberal democracy, and nowadays we tend to drop Western and just call it liberal democracy, but it is important to recognize that the liberal democracy arose in a particular historical context in Europe, but this has a raft of other requirements as well. So rule of law versus rule of man, so prioritizing the rule of law, mass participation in order to gain legitimacy, alternative avenues of influence, so not just electing officials but being able to lobby, being able to protest, being able to influence political systems and the political governance on an ongoing basis rather than every 4 years or 5 years during elections. So this is highly contested as well, and we can look at various things: the stifling of dissent, banning of protests, as well as concerns over the implementation of law, cronyism, corruption. All of these things influence how we view democracies also. If we turn our attention to the other end of the spectrum of authoritarianism, and we do have another complex picture here. So authoritarian political systems are usually positioned as the opposite of democracy, and to be, that's a relatively reasonable position, but with lots of nuance and lots of complexity. So here, authoritarian governments are one where mass legitimacy is not gained through active participation. So we're not getting legitimacy for the political system from a system of elections or participation in governance, but the source of legitimacy is usually placed elsewhere. It can derive from national myths. It can derive from the right to rule, so things like active monarchies as opposed to constitutional monarchies. It can come from theocratic sources, so theocratic authoritarianism would derive its legitimacy from religious texts or from religious traditions. Fascism derives its legitimacy from appeals to a mythical past, as well as just an authoritarian government based upon power will only have the thinnest of appeals to legitimacy, and it's stable because of the expression of power. So that would be a good distinction. Democracy derives at least its theoretical legitimacy from regular participation from those being governed, i.e. the people, whereas authoritarian governments can gain the legitimacy from a wide range of sources, but usually other than the active participation of the governed or the active participation of the people in governance. Now, we did say that this was a spectrum, so it is useful for us to actually look at this as a spectrum here. So we have a spectrum between democracy and totalitarianism, or non-democratic governance, and this is one that may help us understand just the wide range of things or political systems that would fall under this distinction. So as we said, that you have liberal democracies or Western liberal democracies, also conservative democracies. We have radical democracies that you may see. So in Latin America, Bolivia, prior to the Bolivian experiment being halted through a coup. Other radical democracies we can count as Venezuela after the Chavez revolution. We do have reactionary democracies where you could argue the US is in danger of slipping into a reactionary democracy and flirting with authoritarian governance, notwithstanding the recent election of Joe Biden. So you have a broad spectrum here of democratic governance. Also a broad spectrum of non-democratic governance. So as well as the authoritarian system of government, fascism, which unfortunately is no longer just a historical curiosity, but is a clear and present member of political ideologies in the world today. Somehow, it is very much a very specific form of authoritarian or totalitarian government. Where legitimacy is rooted in appeals to a mythical past, a belief usually of some form of racial purity, as well as a corporatist approach to governance and exertion of the use of force. So fascism itself is very much present in a lot of political movements today. Communism is a tricky term. because if we consider, say, how Karl Marx sort of understood a communist government, it would be one based upon free association, the absence of coercion, the absence of state power. However, if we see communism not as not as a theoretical term, but rather a practical reality, most states which have professed to be communist, so thinking about China, the Soviet Union, pre-liberal Vietnam, most of these states were states where there was a lack of active participation from the governed. There is lots of historical debate and discussion about this, and certainly we can see in the early days of the Soviet Union, just during and after the Soviet Revolution or the Russian Revolution, there's a much more complex picture, certainly with the Soviets around Moscow. So it's not a straightforward label, but if we do take a broad view, again, communist states and communist political systems tend to be non-democratic in that the source of legitimacy may derive theoretically from the people, but there is a lack of active, constant participation in governance. As well as dictatorships. So we can look at countries such as Sisi's regime in Egypt, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, although that is an absolute monarchy, which isn't on the spectrum, but would be very close to a dictatorship. As well as a huge range of dictatorships around the world today, where power is very much personal. So Mubarak prior to Sisi, again, the cult of the single leader, power being consolidated within the leader and their immediate family in many cases, but also immediate close allies, and a personal form of governance rather than systemic form of governance would very much determine it or be a distinguishing mark of a dictatorship. We are, however, going to complicate this picture slightly by introducing what's really quite important, as well as the distinction between democratic and authoritarian governance. We're also going to add a look at economic organization to this as well. So we get the IPE, so a political economy spectrum way of classifying or distinguishing between different political systems. So we see here on the axis, top to bottom, liberal governance, authoritarian governance. So we can see this as a proxy for democratic versus non-democratic forms of governance. Where from left to right, see socialist to free market economies. So on the left will be economies where the guiding principles tend to be public ownership, collective economic forms of activity, and participation in economic decision making, whereas on the right we can see with free market economies the prioritization being private capital, the use of free enterprise, minimal interference whether from social participation or government regulation in economic activity. So this helps us distinguish between those governments which may be very authoritarian but either would have state-controlled economies. So we can see at the bottom left communist governments such as say China or the Soviet Union, where there is no mass participation in governance, so they are authoritarian. However, the distinction between, say, a communist political system versus a fascist political system. Fascism exists in a symbiotic relationship with corporate entities, so we often see corporatism as being one of the hallmarks of fascism. So there is an encouragement of private enterprise, whereas with what we understand today to be a communist political system, you'd have authoritarian governance, but with a state-controlled economy rather than a free market economy. Similarly, we can look to the top and we can see that there'll be a big distinction between, say, anarchism, which would have liberal governance. So anarchism would really, anarchism as a philosophy is somewhat oddly nowadays associated with bomb-throwing mayhem, but anarchism as a coherent political philosophy is very much about dismantling sources of unjust authority and unjust power, and encouraging maximum participation in governance for every person, but built around an understanding of a collective economic enterprise versus something like US style libertarianism, which would be on the top right, although it isn't on there on this particular image. But US style libertarianism with things like Peter Thiel and the US Libertarian Party would also share a mistrust of authority and wanting to maximize participation and liberal norms of governance, but with a free market economic system. So the distinction between anarchism and US-style libertarianism would be very, very significant as well. So we do have to understand here, because politics, as we said at the beginning of the video, is really the art of who gets what, why, when, and how. Is very difficult to distinguish between political systems if we ignore the economic element to governance. If politics is about the distribution of resources, fundamentally about the distribution of resources, then we really need to understand political systems in their economic outlook and in their management and engagement with both regional, national, and global economies. So this is possibly a very useful way of understanding political systems. We have to understand them in two different dimensions. Understand them in the dimension of the governance, the relationship of those being governed with those governing, so whether it is a democratic or non-democratic system, as well as the interaction and the engagement with economic systems, so whether it's state-directed or collectivized economic activity, or if it's free market, individual and private capital dominated economy. Only when we understand both of those dimensions can we really understand how that political system actually functions. Now, we've covered a lot of ground so far in this video, but we still have one more question that we're going to look at before the end, although this is a question we're only going to give a brief examination of. There's massively debated and discussed and contested, but that is the question of which political system does international business in particular prefer. And this is something which you guys are going to be looking at in your own reading this week, and which also will be the focus of the seminar. So I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but just to set up some of the underlying dynamics here is, firstly, we have to understand that international businesses can and do operate everywhere, with very, very few exceptions, and those exceptions, such as North Korea, tend to be more because of a political, international and regime-based barriers, rather than an aversion or a reluctance or a refusal to do business in North Korea. So wherever international businesses can invest and get a return on the capital, generally speaking, they do. So we don't have any blacklists that international businesses will refuse to engage with a particular type of political system. However, if we look at the economic dimension of the two dimensions we've just discussed, there's quite a clear preference for free market and low regulation countries, which would make obvious sense, because free market economies tend to be centered around economic activity carried out by private enterprise. Then obviously private enterprises will gravitate towards those kinds of free market economies. But we don't see a refusal to engage in other forms of economies, untapped markets, large potential revenues. All of these things will very much attract businesses despite the political risks that are inherent in them. So we see international businesses still doing business with Venezuela, even when Hugo Chavez was being held up as a huge danger, and so on and so on. See the same thing in Bolivia as well. So while there is a preference for low regulations and free market countries, this is a preference rather than a refusal to engage in other types of system. However, with the other dimension, that between democratic and non-democratic, or not democratic and authoritarian systems, this is a lot more contested and complex. So there is a theoretical preference for democratic systems, in that democratic systems theoretically are more transparent. Governance involves the participation of the governed, therefore any major changes or shifts should be quite clearly visible and discussed and debated in the public sphere before being carried out. So that should make international businesses have a theoretical preference for democracies, because they're able to see changes coming sooner. They're able to engage with legal systems, because democracies in theory should have rule of law rather than rule of man. So there'll be increased confidence in being able to predict legal positions and legal outcomes. However, practical preferences are a very different matter. And I would strongly urge everyone there is must-do reading on whether international businesses prefer to invest in autocratic and authoritarian systems rather than democratic systems.